Hey everyone, this is the Far Left Show. We just did an interview with Alex Gruenenfelder, who is 19 years old and he's running to be mayor of Los Angeles. He is the only progressive in the race. And what else do you think of that?
I mean, he's awesome. You should check him out. Like Johnny said, he's the only progressive running in the race. 100% grassroots campaign. So you should definitely check out our conversation here. And here it is.
Enjoy.
Johnny, let's go.
Yeah. Welcome to the Far Left Show, we break it down, zooming through political news in the lockdown, talking to people, solving issues. These are the kinds of views you won't see on your news. Stick around the show, cause things could get crazy. We even have chihuahuas named Dougie and Daisy. We're called the Far Left to scare the neoliberals, but interview candidates from primary to general. We're the Far Left, break it down, come and join us here and now. Johnny, Daisy, Natalie, Dougie, talk issues affecting this country. We're the Far Left, break it down. Come and join us here and now. Johnny, Daisy, Natalie, Dougie, talk issues starting now.
So we are here with Alex Gruenenfelder. He's running for Los Angeles mayor. Nice to meet you, Alex. Nice to finally talk. I know it's been a while we've been planning this. But how are you doing today?
Great to be here. Yeah, I'm doing pretty well. Campaign launched a little over 2 weeks ago now, and yeah, it's just great to be out there campaigning. It's been since last summer 2020 in the making to get this started. Only progressive campaign in the race, so good to get started and speak with you today.
Awesome. And my first question is, how old are you? Because you seem pretty young.
I am pretty young. I'm the youngest person to ever seek the office. I'm 19 years old. Graduated early from UC San Diego, and running for mayor of Los Angeles. Come from a background of largely student activism, and though I don't have that electoral politics experience, I think that that activism is really what we need to bring to City Hall right now.
And we were looking at actually some of your student activism, and you had a question about his activism.
Yeah. I was looking at your website and I saw that you were part of leading different walkouts. Like you helped lead the walkout to bring awareness to gun reform. I think it also said something about a walkout to bring awareness to survivors of sexual assault. So did you want to speak more on that and about your experience with that?
Absolutely. I think my background wasn't a lot of protest organizing, was in these different things. In the National School Walkout to do with gun reform, I became very involved in that issue here in Los Angeles. Was involved in organizing, hundreds of young students and activists for a walkout that included many thousands in downtown Los Angeles. Learned a lot from that. That was sort of the beginning for me of protest organizing. Began to organize walkouts against the confirmation of the Supreme Court of Brett Kavanaugh, working to bring education and awareness and services to survivors of sexual assault, harassment, and violence. Have worked in a variety of other causes, and really my background being in protesting and activism, that's a lot of what motivated me to run. It was last summer's protests that really got me, that really made me take the leap to thinking about running. And I've worked with a lot of great progressive candidates, a lot of grassroots reforms, grassroots organizing. And so when I found out there wasn't anyone really taking that leap from a progressive side to run for mayor, I decided to apply that experience I've had leading people, especially organizing young people, and try to bring more people into the conversation there.
Yeah, actually, I'm a teacher, and I teach at a school in downtown Los Angeles, and my students actually were a part of that too. So that's why I wanted to ask you about that. It was really great. They felt really like they had a say, and like they were being a part of, so for some of them, it was their first time being a part of a protest. So it was really cool to see. So thanks for being a part of that and the work you did with that.
Yeah, absolutely. And thank you for the work you do as a teacher. I mean, certainly I think that young people being involved in politics and being involved in organizing is a great thing. And I think a lot of that comes down to education and to bringing more people into this space where, whether it's a walkout they go to first or a rally, or even right now during COVID, going to various digital events, I think it's great to see that. And I've been endorsed by a few student groups now, and largely I think that mobilizing a young group of activists is really what can help propel our campaign forward. And that's something I think that a lot of campaigns I admire, campaigns like the Bernie Sanders presidential campaign, really did a lot at mobilizing young people to get out and vote, and also, aside from just voting, getting them out to volunteer and to work hard for the issues that matter.
Yeah.
Would you say that this Bernie Sanders campaign is what sort of ignited your your journey into this political activism, or do you feel like, was there something before, or like how did you start getting involved?
The Bernie Sanders campaign was absolutely something that I cared a lot about. It was soon after the primary last year that I went from being a spectator at organizations like the Democratic Socialists of America to actually joining and trying to get more involved. But I've been involved in political activism for a few years now, starting as a volunteer for progressive candidates, going all the way back to 2016, 2017, and then getting very heavily involved with some, especially progressive Democratic congressional candidates, such as my good friend, Maybe a Girl, who has endorsed my campaign, running for the second time in California's 28th congressional district. And really, I feel that what we do with politics is an absolute extension of what we do with activism. And there's a major intersection between the work being done by activist groups, by protest organizers, by union leaders, and by political candidates. And I've really tried to work near that intersection. And I think I want to bring those values in my campaign.
Right. Well, I wanted to ask you about some sort of specifics about the policies on your website. Mm-hmm. So there's one that talks about unaccompanied rooms in hotels. And I wanted to ask you, first off, how would the city go about assessing if there are unoccupied rooms? And like, what would be the vacancy tax? I'm kind of like curious about how that policy would work, if you want to explain it as well.
Absolutely. And I think a lot of these policies, when it comes to the specifics of executing homelessness, especially when it comes to taxes, bringing a lot of experts in from the fields of people who are directly out there helping unhoused people, I think that really needs to be a priority. And so the specifics of a lot of it are still being worked on. But to give a brief idea of it, I think that with hotels right now, we have seen a more minor scale version of it with the advent of Project Roomkey in Los Angeles. What we need to do is we need to be changing the focus from having these limited time pledged hotel rooms to having a specific long-term system that highlights exactly what the needs are of what we're doing. And for the most part, that means a road to permanent housing. So taking hotel rooms and turning them into bridge housing, for some people, that is a temporary measure to then get them into permanent housing. For other people, they do just need a few months to get back on their feet. And so everyone has different things. Working with social workers, working with people in the community is critical to accomplishing that. When it comes to assessing and when it comes to the vacancy tax, the idea of the vacancy tax is to assess based on the tax records of a lot of these hotels, based on what they're already booking. We have a lot of the resources at our disposal to do this because we have taken, again, minor reforms in this direction. My objection to a lot of the policies we have here in Los Angeles, a lot of the policies being executed by the mayor and the city council, isn't that they're bad policies, but that they're too small scale. And so really, we have a lot of these resources for assessment. When it comes to applying the vacancy tax will be applied to hotels that have above a certain capacity. That capacity is currently 50% in my plan, of rooms that are currently unoccupied. By allowing the city to use those rooms for a period of time, that vacancy tax can be avoided. The idea is that the vacancy tax, which would also be applied to landlords who own more than a certain amount of properties, with the emphasis put, as all of this plan is, on corporate landlords, on corporate property ownership, that the first month, it's a small vacancy tax. It would be a very small penalty to, in some ways, remind you need to get on this and start filling rooms. It's really, for me, once we get to a point where a vacant home has been held by a corporation, a luxury unit in downtown Los Angeles has been held for a year or two, that's when I think month to month the vacancy tax should be increasing in order to make sure they're using that property. Because it's not an objection that I have to them owning the property, period. But what we do need to do is we need to make sure that, especially in these congested, heavily populated areas like downtown Los Angeles, that the units being built are actually being filled. Because we're building a lot of luxury units. We're not building enough affordable housing. And part of that just comes down to the fact that people are buying luxury housing that they're not living in. And if there's an incentive in place then for people to actually be in these units, it's going to increase the overall supply of housing, because we have the units in Los Angeles to make these changes, but we need to make sure that people are actually living in them.
Yeah. This question might sound more conservative than I actually am, but in terms of a vacancy tax, and I know that, we don't have it all fleshed out yet, but I was wondering if there's a vacancy tax, if it's unoccupied, if let's say a luxury hotel brings in unhoused people, and they have to pay, like, let's say electricity, water, they have to clean the rooms. It's like, is the vacancy tax, like, is it worth it? Might they just pay the vacancy tax, I think is, and then maybe where would the vacancy tax go into? Would that go into homeless services or? Yeah,
absolutely. And I think that's a great and very valid question. First and foremost, yes, the vacancy tax will be going directly into a fund to help fund permanent housing in Los Angeles. We had a 0.5% sales tax increase that the voters voted for in order to really fund these housing first policies, but it just hasn't been executed. So a lot of the money is there, but when we bring in more money from the vacancy tax, it's not just an incentive to get people housed. It is money that's going to be going directly back into services in the community. Services like building more permanent housing, building more bridge housing, providing more mental health services, providing more drug rehabilitation services, really an overall comprehensive approach to homelessness that is built on compassion, that is built on progressive policy, and not built on criminalization. When it comes to the specific spending hotels will have to undertake, while there is a certain amount that they will have to undertake, the city of Los Angeles will be covering some of those day-to-day costs. Those are going to be things under my plan that we are able to fund. Some of it is even going to be programs funded at hotels, the cleaning costs, the food people need, the making up of the rooms. The city's going to be funding a lot of that, and that in turn is going to be funding by the proceeds from the vacancy tax. So absolutely, while the specifics of the numbers need to be more crunched in regard to each individual hotel, we will make it in the best interest of the hotel to house people, because that's really what we want here. And there's definitely been, I think, more of a movement to take over hotel rooms, especially during the pandemic. But I think what all of us are realizing, even as we come out of this pandemic, is that the crises we are facing on our streets are going to get a lot worse in the next year or so. More people are going to be on the streets. And so we need to be planning for these long-term solutions. And so absolutely working with everyone from economists to housing advocates, to those who are actually building permanent housing, to get this exactly right, to make sure it can work for the most number of people possible.
Is there, sorry, the vacancy tax is really interesting to me. And I just wanted to ask one last thing about that, unless you had any questions. But is there already an organization or a sort of a movement within Los Angeles for the vacancy tax, or in the United States, or is it something that, like, you really want to bring into the political sphere?
I would love to bring it more into the political sphere. I believe that it is a thing that has been nodded to by a lot of politicians. People like the great Councilwoman Nithya Raman, who was elected last year, who I was a big supporter of her campaign, she has referred to policies like the vacancy tax. She campaigned actively on a platform of ending homelessness in a similar way to myself. She has paid tribute to the concept, as have, council member Mike Bonin. This is a thing that people have discussed, but it's a thing that without that mayoral leadership, if we could get it through the city council, it's going to pass narrowly. And I know a lot of great city council candidates, progressives who I'm talking to right now, who I'm talking to about the system, and they're saying, oh, if I get in there, I'd support that policy. But we need to make sure that we have everyone at the city level on board with this idea if we're going to implement it.
Yeah.
Okay.
The vacancy tax is really interesting to me too. And something else that was interesting to me when I was looking at your website was where you talked about the Olympics in Los Angeles. You said, and we won't allow stadiums to be built on land stolen from the working class via eminent domain. And I thought that was really interesting. So I wanted to see, can you just talk a little bit more about that and also the history of that happening in Los Angeles?
Yes, definitely. I think that the Olympics are a thing that a lot of us watch, but at least for myself, it's a thing that you don't necessarily think about the consequences of, especially when they're happening in cities around the world. Eminent domain for sports stadiums, for hotel projects, is something that happens all too often in this country. Eminent domain is, of course, a system that was developed that private property could be used at fair market compensation in order to help the greater public good. Things in theory like if you need to build a pipe to get clean water to a working class neighborhood under someone's mansion, that would be something that could be used eminent domain for. Something like during a pandemic, if you need to take over a convention center so people have a roof over their head to spend the night. These are uses of eminent domain that are what we like to think about. But very problematically, especially in regard to the Olympics, eminent domain has been used as a tool that benefits the few at the expense of the many. In 1957 through 1959, when Dodger Stadium was just a concept that was being thought about, many families, dozens of families, had their homes bulldozed very close to my house here in Echo Park for what was supposed to be an affordable housing project. But at the city level, there was a lot of debate, and this working class community that already had been bulldozed in a very divisive move, supposedly for affordable housing, that land was then converted into what's now Dodger Stadium, which sits on the remains of a lot of working class people's homes. In nations around the world, nations like Japan, where the Olympics are about to be in Tokyo, we see people who are being evicted from their homes in order to support a 2.5-week ceremony, or in order to support a football stadium that's going to be used one day a week, a few weeks out of the year. And that's just not an acceptable system in my mind. We've seen eminent domain, although it seems like a good concept. We've seen it used in situations like the construction of our freeways, which we take for granted here in Los Angeles. Those freeways were constructed by bulldozing a lot of homes primarily owned by African-American and Latinx residents. So really, I think that when I come in, especially as we plan for the Olympics, it is my belief that the Olympics coming to Los Angeles will be a net negative for the city. Mm-hmm. But if it is going to happen, as mayor, I'm not going to let eminent domain be used to bulldoze people's homes that have been in their families for generations. I'm not going to allow it to permanently increase the size of the LAPD. I'm not going to allow it to be used to evict working people from their homes. And that's the reality of the situation we're facing. And although this is a 2022 election, we're not getting the Olympics until 2028. It's a crisis that the next mayor is going to be dealing with immediately.
Speaking of the next mayor, and I checked out on Wikipedia. They've got you on there, social justice advocate was what they say you are. But they have Joe Buscaino, who's at the top, right? He's running. What do you have? I know he's a very experienced person, council member, right? What do you have that someone like Joe Buscaino does not for mayor?
Yes, Joe Buscaino is, um, it was the consideration of him running for mayor that partially motivated me to make this run. Uh, he is a reserve LAPD officer, a former full-time LAPD officer, mounted a long shot city council bid that was backed by the police union in the early 2010s, and has been serving there for years, helping the agenda of a very special interest group, largely made up of police, real estate developers, and other corrupt special interests. Um, for me, one can see my background in activism, one can see my background in organizing, and one can see my policies. But someone might say, well, Joe Buscaino has been at the city council. You don't have a record at the city council. We can see his record. And that's exactly my point. Please look at his record. This is a record that is full of votes in favor of increasing the LAPD's budget, in favor of ramping up sweeps of homelessness encampments, not actually putting our unhoused neighbors into homes, but just moving them out of neighborhoods, from neighborhood to neighborhood. Policies that not only are cruel, but don't only, but that, bleh. Policies that are not only cruel, but don't make logical sense. Like the idea of saying that people can't camp outside of a homeless shelter. That was a policy proposed by Joe. It does not make sense. It is not only a policy that is not compassionate, but it is a policy that does not make sense, because you can ask almost any unhoused person and they're going to tell you that they'd rather be nearer to a place with services than they're not going to be safe if they're moved under a freeway, under overpass, where they're not near anyone. And so these policies by Councilmember Joe Buscaino are really policies that are not only cruel, that not only benefit a very small group of people, but they're policies that simply don't work. When I'm coming to City Hall, I'm doing it with a plan to bring people who have been working in housing services, people who have been working in social justice activism, to City Hall to execute plans that are going to get things done, that are going to clean up the problems we have at the LAPD, that are going to protect working people from the Olympics, and that are going to end homelessness. My vision is a vision that is for a very different Los Angeles, where we see our problems not as a permanent thing, not as tens of thousands of people are on our streets. We don't see that as something that's always going to be there, because it wasn't always here, and it doesn't need to be. Countries around the world have struggled with homelessness, and many have been able to overcome the problem. A vote for Councilmember Joe Buscaino is a vote to keep pushing money around and keep pushing people around. My vision is one that's going to solve the crisis for decades to come.
Say no to Joe. You heard it here. But I really like when you mentioned other countries have done a really good job, taking care of homelessness. Could you talk a little bit about maybe a couple of, just throw out some countries? I don't know. Just would love to hear.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that countries like those in Scandinavia have long had a different approach toward housing in general. I think that's definitely something that should be looked at. My main example when it comes to housing is Singapore. Singapore's approach, which is not perfect by any means. It definitely has flaws. But part of what Singapore did is they took a country that largely had a social opposition of public housing in a similar way to our country, and made it something that the land that was just owned by the government was converted into a lot of public housing that were permanent options people had. And not only did it make sure that there weren't people sleeping on the streets at night, but it also took away a lot of the social stigma of becoming homeless. One of the issues we have here in the United States is that we had public housing projects that were constructed in the mid-20th century largely, but they were greatly complicated by social stigma, by racial prejudice, by classism. And so often this was intertwined with being pushed to the fringes of society, with being over-policed, with increased crime. And when we look at public housing, we should be looking at countries all over the world that have simply taken a different approach to public housing. Because when you look at homelessness, we're one of the only countries that struggles in the way that we do. And that's because we've taken a criminalization approach to this entire issue. And that's why I point to a country less so for its housing approach, but for its approach to things like drugs, which is Portugal. And when we look at a nation like Portugal, we see that our approach, this approach of drug criminalization, the idea that you can just be arrested and suddenly that's going to help you with your drug problem, is just not realistic. A study from UCLA showed that up to 1/3 of people who are on the streets struggle with some form of drug problem. And I've read a variety of studies on this. The studies range from being at around saying it's 20% to 50%. I think the UCLA metrics are the most valid and the most logical. But in any case, we know that as other countries deal with these problems, they're dealing with them in ways that are not only compassionate, but they're practical. Putting more people into jail cells for their drug problem, for the crime of sleeping on the street, is not only cruel, but it doesn't work at solving the problem long term. So I say, look to Scandinavia, look to Portugal, look to Singapore, and you'll find a lot of the solutions that I want to implement right here in Los Angeles.
Yeah, and someone that you worked with, I saw on your website, was George Gascon, who won the district attorney position in Los Angeles. So it's really cool that you helped with his campaign. And I'm wondering, when you're elected, how do you plan to work with Gascon to address some of the things that you mentioned to keep our communities safer?
Yes, George Gascon ran a great campaign. I was a big fan of his campaign. I think that part of what his election proved to myself and to a lot of people is that even if you have dozens of elected officials who are doing the wrong thing, even one official doing the right thing can make changes overnight. Changes like no longer trying juvenile offenders as adults. Things like not prosecuting a minor first-time crime as a felony to send someone to jail. Things like not prosecuting in Los Angeles anymore for the death penalty. And these are things that are really critical. So for me, I think that when it comes to what our district attorney does, also this next election we'll be electing a new city attorney. Whoever is elected, they are prosecuting or choosing not to prosecute in a lot of important cases, but they are only able to do what they do with the help of the laws that we put into place. So by moving away from criminalization on drugs, moving away from a criminalization approach generally, and moving toward less funding for the LAPD and more funding for education, for housing. These are the policies that are going to make it easier to be a district attorney in the future because there's not as much crime. We're seeing a large spike right now in crime in Los Angeles. It's something I've talked to a lot of voters who are worried about. We know what the root causes are. The more people are out of work due to a pandemic, the more people are evicted from their homes, the more people are food insecure or living on the streets, the more crime there's going to be. But if we can support schools, if we can support housing services, if we can support rehabilitation and healthcare, then we're going to have a decline in crime and it's going to be easier to be a district attorney so that when George Gascon is working to prosecute cases, these are cases where, once you are sentenced for something like armed robbery, for example, we could work to get people more services rather than more criminalization. Because to give that example of armed robbery, that's a crime that I think we all recognize is a negative for society. But putting someone away for a decade or more in prison and they come out without services, without help, is just going to lead to a cycle of more crime, and it's not going to make us safer. So really, I would love to work with George Gascon. I would love to work with members of the city council in order to build a better future for Los Angeles, built on less criminalization, built on criminal justice reform, and more funds for social services over the police.
I love just the way that you're talking about defunding the police, as well as Kenneth Mejia Do you? I'm going to throw this out here because we are the Far Left Show, right? And we have Angela Davis up there, and we have a book that we really like called "Our Prisons Obsolete." But like, how far could we go in terms of like abolishing this sort of prison state that we've built up here in the United States? I mean, like, I know it takes a lot of reform, but could you kind of just speak about like your views on prison and like what you think we should do to like reform it?
Absolutely, and I think I do like your Angela Davis poster. Great alum of my university.
Mhm.
Yeah.
Certainly, I think on that question, the question of the future of policing and the future of prisons in the United States, I think that a future beyond crime, in a way that we see it now, is absolutely a possibility. And certainly, I've read the works of thinkers like Angela Davis, and I think that that's something we need to be keeping in mind. It's something we need to be planning for, because at the very least, we know that what we're doing here in regard to how we do prisons is fundamentally wrong. And again, I point back to Scandinavia. I point to the Norwegian system. I point to these different things. And I think that once you can get to that point, this point where you prioritize a different view of public safety, these are absolutely issues that can be solved. Because for me, I think that an era beyond the way we see policing today and the way we see prisons today, absolutely on the table, and something that we should be considering and something we should be working toward. I think that's the thing that scares some people about the defund the police movement and these different important social movements, is this idea that we are in the morning going to suddenly cut all funding and it's going to be lawlessness. And that's simply not only is that not what I believe would happen, but it's not the actual systemic way of doing this. We need to establish what our goals are and then work toward those goals in a way of sensible reforms, in a way that moves us toward a better system. And so for me, it's a thing of, if we can slowly cut down the LAPD's budget, in some ways quickly, cut out immediately some of these things we're putting funding toward, things like military gear, get rid of it in the morning, and cutting that funding and putting it toward things that are actually going to make people safer, then we can get to an era in which, children years from now are growing up in a society where they read about what we do now with policing and what we do now with prisons, and just see it as completely ridiculous.
Yeah.
No scholars that I speak to when it comes to this issue actually think that an approach of more criminalization works for anything. Criminalization builds more criminalization. Let us build a society built on rehabilitation, a society built on coming together as a community for justice, so that all people can live in the community safely and in a future beyond the way we now see prisons and policing.
Mm-hmm. And I also know you're for legalizing marijuana. That's correct?
I am. I believe the state of California is a bit ahead of me on that, but yes, I'm for legalizing marijuana. And I believe that that's an issue that still needs to be brought up, because one of my opponents, the city attorney, Mike Fuhrer, was responsible for shutting down about half of Los Angeles's medical marijuana facilities a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
I not only think that's immoral, but I think it's contrary to what the people have been clear that they want.
Mhm.
An approach of more criminalization doesn't work, and the system we have right now of licensing benefits major corporations. It benefits the ultra wealthy. We need to make sure that we are able to have an equitable distribution of resources in terms of those licenses. And that means if someone with not a lot of money, not a lot of cash to put down, is applying from a marginalized community, we should be able to work to make sure that they can open a dispensary, because that's what the people of California voted for.
Right.
Okay. I'm going to ask you just a few, not rapid fire questions, but just several questions. I know.
Okay, I'm ready.
Bill Clinton's been asked this. Kamala Harris has been asked this, but have you ever smoked weed? Is that something you enjoy?
Yes.
Yes. Yes. Oh, that's awesome. All right. I think that's cool. And I also have another question. I don't know if you want to ask one
No,
question.
you
But,
got it.
what college within UCSD are you from?
Eleanor Roosevelt.
Ooh, that's a nice one.
Because he's a UCSD alum too, actually.
Yeah, I'm from Mir.
Oh, I knew you were from UCSD in the back of my mind, but I didn't know what particular college.
Yes.
That's cool. I like ERC. I think it's a great part of the campus community. Definitely was not what I expected when I first applied to UCSD, because I did no background research at all on any of the colleges, and was startled by the sheer amount of work that is ERC.
That's a hard one. Yeah. Did you have any questions?
No, go ahead.
No questions at all?
I'm
What kind of music you like? It's my last random question.
I'm definitely a punk rock person, and I think that's something I just love for what it is. That's what I grew up a lot listening to. My father was a music video director, so I definitely had a lot of exposure to music. Also, I felt like I got very involved in the punk community. Even during my time at UCSD, I would hang out at the Che Cafe a lot. I was a volunteer there, and yeah, I think there's a great bridge between music and politics in things like punk rock.
Who do you recommend we listen to? Because I don't think we've ever really listened to too much punk rock.
I think there's just a lot of great options out there. I would say one of my favorites would be like Dead Kennedys. I think is a great choice for very, very hardcore punk rock. I'm a fan of everything from pop punk to hardcore. Dead Kennedys is also a weird example because the lead singer of Dead Kennedys, Jello Biafra, ran for mayor of San Francisco when he was my age, which is something I think about when I think about young people running for office.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's a recommendation. Really, I'm excited to have concerts coming back in the next year or so as the pandemic comes to an end. Very happy to be fully vaccinated. Went to a concert for fully vaccinated people. That was very fun. But I'm excited to see the return of things, and definitely I'll be heading down to UC San Diego to go back to the Che at some point once it reopens.
Awesome.
Well, thank you, Alex. It's been so much fun. You are incredibly smart and great at answering these random questions that we're throwing at you. So I appreciate you coming on.
Do you have social media
Yes.
that you're active on that you would recommend people follow you on?
Yes. All of my social media, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, is Mayor Alex LA. I'm most active on Instagram and Facebook, but please follow us on Twitter at Mayor Alex LA. We've just started our Twitter and really trying to build a Twitter following. So check that out, and mayoralex.com, where you can read more about our policies, more about me, and donate to our campaign. We're fully grassroots, so we need your help to drive the campaign forward.
Awesome.
You've got our full support.
Yeah, definitely.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Thank
Alex.
you.
Good luck with
Yeah.
everything.
Take care, Alex.
Bye.
Bye.